In this section, we're going to talk about how companies define cost. We're going to go through some terminology that you need to know for managerial and cost accounting. The first term we're going to talk about is a cost object. What is a cost object? All a cost object is anything for which managers want to find a separate measurement of cost. So what could be considered a cost object? Let's look at an example. We'll look at the Toyota company, Toyota Corporation, and let's look at a particular model of car. An individual unit, could that be considered a cost object? Would Toyota want to find out how much it costs to produce this particular model? Yes, they would want to find out, therefore it could be a cost object. How about different models within the corporation, such as the RAV4 or the Corolla? Would they want to find out how much different models would cost, or even different model lines, the RAV4 line or the Corolla line? Would they want to find out how much that would cost? Yes, they would. Therefore, those could be also considered a cost object. Moving along, if we look at, let's say, geographic locations, would Toyota want to find out whether their US operations or their European operations, how much those would cost? They would want to find that out, and if they do, the European segment or the US segment could be considered a cost object. How about different departments within the company, such as human resource or accounting? Yep, you guessed it. Those could also be considered cost objects. Now that we know what a cost object is, let's look at the different types of costs. Once you have identified your cost object, such as a particular car model, we have direct costs. Direct costs are defined as costs that can be traced directly to a cost object. And then we have indirect costs, which are costs that cannot be directly traced to the cost object. Let's look at some examples. Let's assume that a Starbucks cup of coffee is your cost object. What are the direct costs for this cup of coffee? Remember, the direct cost can be directly traced to this cup of coffee. We can trace coffee beans, we can trace water, also cream, the sugar, the actual cup and lid, and also the salary of the employee that made and served you the coffee. All those are costs that can be traced to your cup of coffee. Now, for the same cup of coffee, let's look at what could be our indirect costs. Remember, the indirect costs are costs that cannot be traced to that particular cup of coffee. How about the salary of the other employees who work at the store? Those cannot be traced to that particular cup because they didn't work on this particular cup. The store rent, things like depreciation on store equipment and furniture, the cost of national advertising campaign, the CEO's salary, the rent for the corporate headquarters, also the depreciation of office equipment that they use in the headquarters. All those cannot be traced, those costs cannot be traced to your cost object, which is your cup of coffee. Let's take a look at a different cost object. This time your cost object is going to be an individual Starbucks store. What would be the direct cost for this particular store? Earlier our cost object was a cup of coffee. This time it's a retail store. Again, remember, direct costs are costs that can be directly traced to this particular cost object. You have the cost of coffee beans, of cream, sugar, cups, lids. You also have coffee packets they have for resale. The cost of all the employee salaries, every single employee, including the manager, their salary is a direct cost this time. Depreciation on store equipment, utilities, rent for the store. Also, any store-specific advertising that this store does, just for this retail store, would be considered a direct cost. Now, if it's a national advertising campaign, then it's not direct because that advertising campaign, the cost relating to that is for all the Starbucks stores, but let's say that they send some Valpak coupons or something that you can be used at this particular store, that would be considered a direct cost for this store. Now, for our retail store, as our cost objects, let's look at what our indirect costs would be. Again, indirect costs cannot be traced to the cost object, so we're looking at things that we cannot, the cost of items that we cannot trace to this particular Starbucks retail store. The CEO's salary is something we cannot trace. Same with the corporate headquarters rent, depreciation on machinery used at the corporate headquarters, other stores' expenses. So, any other retail stores, let's say you've got one retail store in Louisville, Texas, but the retail store in Corinth, Texas, those expenses would be indirect costs if we're taking the Louisville Starbucks store as our cost object. Also, any national advertising campaigns that you do, the cost of those would be considered indirect cost for our particular retail store. To summarize, the total cost of a product is the sum of direct costs and indirect costs. Your direct costs can be traced to your cost object. However, your indirect costs cannot be traced to your cost object. So what we have to do is find a way to assign, or what we mean by assign is to attach these costs to your cost object. We say that we allocate, so you need to know the term allocate. We allocate the indirect cost to the cost object based on some criteria. We will learn about allocation later in the near future. So let's say you walked into Starbucks and bought a tall caramel ribbon crunch frappuccino for $3.95. You are paying for direct costs such as the coffee, the ice, the cup, the lid, and so on and so forth. Plus, you're also paying for that indirect costs such as the CEO's salary. That $3.95 you pay for that cup of frappuccino has all your direct costs, indirect costs, plus a markup. Markup is that profit Starbucks earns when they sell you that cup of coffee.